Gεια σας. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greeks, Greekness, or your own ethnic background. Happy Halloween. Trigger warning. There's talk of murder, sexual assault, necrophilia, and animal sacrifice in today's episode, because we're talking about ghost stories from ancient Greece. Like much of Greek culture, these stories influence world culture, literature, even religious practices. You'll recognize the restless spirits, vengeful ghosts, protective spirits, and ancestors summoned to communicate with the living in Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, Shirley Jackson, Stephen King, and most horror movies. Our understanding of life in ancient Greece comes from the histories, letters, and philosophical texts written by those living back then, and the plays, the epic poems of Homer, the papyri of the ancient cults, art, sculpture, mosaics, stelae, or grave markers, the contents of tombs. Even the drinking cups of ancient Greece were illustrated with the myths and the activities of everyday life. There are many ghost stories, and a complicated hierarchy of dark goddesses, spirits, ghosts, and demons in the afterlife. We had to narrow it down. We chose the restless dead. We'll also explain the funeral rites that were meant to keep them in the underworld. In ancient Greece, ghosts were described as wraith-like in the underworld, pale, nearly transparent, or in hauntings like smoke, or black enough to be mistaken for shadows. Some ghosts appear in the dreams or nightmares of family, friends, or those who did them harm in life. Dreams were thought to be a bridge between the living world and the afterlife. Some ghosts look exactly as they did in life, if they haven't been dead very long. Some make their presence known through sounds alone. Most cannot speak unless certain measures are taken. 5th century BCE philosopher Socrates believed specters lurking in graveyards were the souls of the wicked, forced to wander cemeteries as punishment for their bad behavior in life. He also speaks of murderers haunted by their victims. Author Lacey Collison Morley writes, "The ghost is regarded as the deceased person permitted or condemned by the powers of the lower world to hold communication with survivors on earth." The restless dead were a constant concern for ancient Greeks. They were believed responsible for illness, madness, infertility, and bad luck. Homer's 9th century BCE epics are soaked in magic, monsters, and the restless dead. The Iliad and the Odyssey create the framework for understanding much of Greek history and culture, including the restless dead. It's believed they both reflect the ancient Greek understanding of the afterlife and influence its study by historians, philosophers, and writers in the centuries that follow. There were 3 reasons the dead might remain restless: lack of a proper burial, violent death, or an untimely death before expected milestones in life could be reached. In the Odyssey, hero Odysseus meets restless shades from all these categories when he visits the entrance to Hades to seek advice from the spirit of a seer. He's been sent there by Kirke, the sorceress who changed Odysseus' men to swine before she fell in love with him and changed them back. She's promised to help Odysseus get home and tells him he must take a strange way round and come to the cold homes of Death and pale Persephone. You shall hear prophecy from the rapt shade of blind Tiresias of Thebes, forever charged with reason even among the dead. To him alone of all the flitting ghosts, Persephone has given a mind undarkened. The dead are described as existing in a dreary gray world, almost zombie-like, until a supplicant's prescribed actions awakens them. Kirke sends Odysseus and his crew sailing north with a black ram and black ewe aboard to a deserted land to find the crumbling homes of death, moving toward the sorrowing water and the streams of wailing that run out of the river Styx. By burning torrents thundering at the rock, he's to dig a well shaft, measuring the square of his forearm, and pour out libations to the unnumbered dead. These are sweet milk and honey, followed by sweet wine and clear water, then scattered handfuls of white barley. he must pray to the dead and swear when he finally arrives home to Ithaca, he'll sacrifice his finest heifer in their honor and sacrifice to Tiresias the most beautiful black lamb in his flock. After his prayers, Odysseus cuts the throats of the ewe and the ram, turning his head away until the shadows rise. Odysseus' crews skin the animals and burn the offerings to the lord of the underworld, Hades, and his queen, Persephone. Hordes of dead shadows are drawn to the bloody pit where the animals were killed, but Odysseus fends them off with his sword. Metal has power over ghosts, and there are tales of ghosts being trapped in their tombs by laying iron across them. The dead needed to taste the blood of a sacrifice in order to recognize those around them. Their minds came out of the darkness they lived in. The blood allowed them to speak and remember their past lives. As he waits for the seer to appear, Odysseus recognizes the shade of the youngest member of his crew, Elpenor. In his rush to push his crew aboard their ship to travel from Kirkis Island to the entrance of Hades, Odysseus and the others didn't notice the young man, still drunk from a night of partying, passed out on Kirkis' roof. When the call to assemble started him awake, Elpenor missed a step on the ladder going down, fell, and broke his neck. He lay there, unburied, unmourned, as shipmates sailed away. Now he begs Odysseus to return to the island when his business is done and properly burn him and all of his belongings. Then build him a proper burial mound marked by the oar he pulled in their travels. If Odysseus doesn't do this, he'll tempt the wrath of the gods, Elpenor warns. The undead could haunt, harass, cause madness, illness, bad fortune, but they couldn't physically injure or kill the living. Disrespecting the dead was an affront to the gods. Their minions could be called on by the restless dead to exact punishment. The Furies, the Erinyes, Demons. Along with society's disapproval, the family and friends of the deceased risked their own lives and chance of a peaceful afterlife if they neglected their responsibilities to the dead. Devoted families would do anything and everything to ensure their loved ones rested in eternal peace. To this day, Greeks follow certain rites and rituals in making their goodbyes to their loved ones, including praying for their eternal peace. Odysseus promises Elpenor his honorable burial and fulfills that promise later. But before he speaks to Tiresias, he spots another shade he recognizes, his mother, Anticlea, who died while Odysseus was fighting the Trojan War. He holds her off with his sword away from the blood until Tiresias approaches it, sips, and finally speaks. He warns Odysseus of troubles ahead before disappearing. Big surprise. Now Odysseus allows his mother to sip the blood so she'll know him and tell him how his family is back on Ithaca. When Odysseus tries to embrace her, he's disappointed. Ghosts might appear as they did in life, but their souls remain separated from the body and cannot be touched. While Odysseus speaks to his mother, other shades approach the bloody pit. The restless dead, including new brides who died before their wedding night, and virgin maids who'd never had the opportunity to marry. Soldiers in their armor who'd gone unburied on the battlefields. King Agamemnon, who fought with him at Troy, speaks to Odysseus after sipping the blood and recognizing him. The king was murdered in his bath by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover. Payment for sacrificing their daughter to the gods for favorable weather for sailing to war. We'll talk about their fates later. Achilles, the greatest of Greek warriors who fell at Troy, also makes an appearance. He recognizes and speaks to Odysseus without the benefit of a sip of blood. This may have been because of his demigod status. His mother was a sea nymph, his father a grandson of Zeus. Or maybe his superhero status, or both. Throughout the mythology of the dead, Achilles and a few others are given special status and don't have to follow the rules of the dead the regular folk do. Even in Hades, Achilles is a hero, but he's unimpressed, saying he'd rather live as a manual laborer for a poor farmer on strict rations than lord it over all of the exhausted dead. The gods can grant elite dead entry to paradise, and Achilles eventually receives a beautiful island where he can live out eternity. Most poor Slavs can only hope for peace. The writings of the ancient Greeks supply a how-to to ensure the newly dead and their loved ones all rest easy. We mentioned earlier, in order for the soul to find peace, survivors of the departed had to perform funeral rites to send them to the afterlife and remember the dead to keep them there. Funeral rites were very specific and strictly adhered to, unless those responsible for carrying them out wanted to be haunted in their dreams by their relatives. The women of the family would wash the body of the departed. Aristophanes, the 5th century BCE playwright, describes vine branches and the herb oreganos were strewn under the body. The scent of the herb was meant to repel animals and insects that might damage the body, affecting the soul's repose. The regani was also used to repel ghosts and demons. I didn't come across what ghosts and demons might want with the body, but I'm still reading through piles of books. Maybe this is the whole revenant story again. Archaeologists report sometimes finding amulets in excavated tombs, so there was a need to protect against something. Maybe it was keeping the restless soul away from the body, or the demons. There are tales of revenants, cousins to zombies, that we talked about last Halloween on our episode about Greek vampires. The 3rd day of death, the body was removed to its final resting place, accompanied by mourners singing laments. Torches led funeral processions to light the way of the dead on their journey into the darkness of the underworld. Lamps had been found in ancient graves. Offerings were made at the grave during the funeral, including libations of milk and honey, water and wine, or oil. A supper was presented to satisfy the hunger of the dead. Lacey Collison Morley, in her 1912 book, Greek and Roman Ghost Stories, says the soul of the dead subsists on the libations and offerings it receives from the living, and those who have no friends or family on earth are starving and famished. After the meal, other offerings are made, this time gifts specific to the deceased. Clothing, jewelry, flowers, weapons, mirrors were laid in the tomb, all of the departed's belongings that they might need in the afterlife. Nearly all the ghosts in the literature refer to the burning of their bodies and belongings, so we assume this was the process with most of the ancient death. Elaborately carved grave markers, stele, were left to mark the tomb. Sarah Iles Johnson, in her excellent book, Restless, Dead, Encounters Between the Living and Dead in Ancient Greece, says stele might be decorated with ribbons, myrtle branches, or bundles of colored wool. It was typical for survivors to cut off their hair and offer to the dead, possibly symbolizing human sacrifice. It also marked the mourner for those around them. Everybody knew they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. After the funeral, mourners returned home for the memorial meal. Johnson says the first real meal following death unified survivors and their ability and willingness to move forward in the land of the living, away from the deceased. On the 3rd, 9th, 30th, and possibly a year after the death, additional offerings were made at the grave. These visits might also occur on the anniversary of the deceased's birth or death. It's assumed mourners actually visited the tombs much more frequently and noisily, maybe, because in the 6th century BCE, Athenian statesman Solon enacted laws to calm down the rowdyism involved in memorializing the dead. This reminded me of current rituals in the Greek church. Not the rowdyism so much, although I have been to a few noisy Greek funerals. My family is extra. It reminded me of the memorial meal after the funeral, like the repasts held by other denominations, but especially the honoring of the dead on particular days following the funeral. The 3rd day might be remembered, always the 40th, which has ties to Christianity, the 1st-year anniversary of the death, and traditionally the 3rd, 7th, 10th, and so on, annually if the family chooses. These current memorial services include prayers for the dead for eternal peace. A boiled wheat dish blessed by the priest is offered to everyone in the church after the memorial prayers. The grave is visited, and a handful of the boiled wheat is scattered over the grave. Then family and friends leave for the memorial meal, which used to be at the home of the deceased or their children when I was a kid. Now it's mostly held in restaurants. Greek restaurants that get it. It's what's expected for the remembrance of the dead. and apparently always has been. The dead liked to be greeted by the living when they passed, says Johnston. Some tombs were placed near roads so the dead could be hailed by passersby. Is this something modern Greeks do? Please let me know, because I've always done it, even as a kid. Whenever I pass a cemetery where a friend or relative is buried, I always call out to them. My kids think it's creepy, but I feel obliged. Childless Greeks adopted heirs to ensure their funeral rites. Johnston says the right to inherit property was tied to the performance of these rites. Sometimes the heir had to prove they were meeting their obligations to the dead before they inherited. The largest number of restless dead are those without a proper send-off. They will haunt the irresponsible to remind them of their neglect, like Elpenor in the Odyssey. In the Iliad, Achilles has a vision of his fallen fellow warrior and sometime lover, Patroclus, who begs Achilles to bury him properly so he can pass over to the afterlife. In the morning, the Greek soldiers build a funeral pyre to send Patroclus on his way. I couldn't find my copy of the Iliad for an explanation of this neglect of a fallen warrior. Traditionally, in histories, poems, plays, letters, ancient Greeks refer again and again to the absolute priority given to proper burial, especially for soldiers who deserve a respectful goodbye for their sacrifice and may already be prone to restlessness because of their violent deaths. The unburied weren't admitted to Hades, unable to live in the real world, barred from eternal rest. Histories of the 5th century BCE Battle of Aegospotame report the execution of 4,000 Athenian captives by the Spartan military leader Lysandros. Another Spartan general, Pausanias, condemned Lysandros for the scandal of not burying the Athenian dead, reminding him the Athenians buried the dead of their enemies, the Persians, after the Battle of Marathon less than 100 years earlier. This makes Lysandros contemptible. In our episode on the Sacred Band of Thieves in June 2024, we talked about opposing armies halting after battle to bury their dead. The victors first, then the defeated were allowed to bury their dead before submitting to capture. It was the honorable thing to do to make sure the soldiers all had peace. The spirits of the unburied dead are bound to the place where their bodies lay. Yet Elpenor appears at the outskirts of Hades, pleading for burial so he can enter. The unburied dead hover outside the barrier to Hades like hungry waifs outside of a bakery window. Yet at the same time, they haunt the place where they've died until a proper funeral is performed for them. Achilles is an exceptional restless ghost. When he dies on the battlefield, he's immediately given full-force funeral. His body and belongings burned, the prayers, the whole Megillah. His ashes are mixed in an urn with those of Patroclus. Everything that should have been done to put him at rest is done. But he won't allow the Greeks to leave Troy. His spirit demands they make a sacrifice to his tomb, the daughter of Priam, the defeated Trojan king. Johnston says, the violently dead are sometimes viewed as dangerous because they are imagined to be out of place. Being haunted by anyone's ghost is scary, but Achilles was especially badass. The Greeks agreed, sacrificed the unfortunate young women to Achilles, and finally left for home. Moving on from Homer, Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and magistrate, writes to a friend about a famous ghost that haunted a house in Athens for many years. Its owners were harassed nearly to death by the ghost of an elderly man. He was gaunt, long-bearded, in chains. He rattled ceaselessly as he moaned. This sounds like every haunted house story we've ever read about or seen on TV. Their health destroyed, the owners tried desperately to sell the house, but their situation was too well known. Neighbors and passersby said they could hear the moans and clank of metal and chains from outside. The house was abandoned and began to fall into disrepair. Finally, it was offered up for rent, cheap. Greek Stoic philosopher Athenodoros, an advisor to Roman Emperor Augustus, arrived in Athens and was looking for housing and came across the abandoned house. When he questioned the low rent, he was told the story of the haunting. Athenodoros rented the house immediately. He prided himself on the logic, reason, and self-control he was famous for. He brought his books and writing materials into the house and settled down to work and wait for the spirit. In the dark of night, the ghost appeared, moaning and clanking. It motioned Athenodoros to follow. Athenodoros didn't look up from his work. He ignored the specter as it stood over him, howling and beating its chains together. He motioned for it to wait until he'd finished his work. Finally, he stood and followed the ghost throughout the house, out into the courtyard, where it suddenly vanished. Athenodoros marked the spot he'd last seen the ghost and retired for the night. The next morning, he contacted city officials, urging them to order the courtyard dug up. When the garden was excavated, they found a very old skeleton in chains. The bones were gathered, and the victim was given a respectful public burial. The ghost was never seen or heard from again. Plutarch, in the 1st century CE, tells a story from his hometown of Cheronia in northern central Greece. A man named Damon, who might have been a brigand, his name sounds too close to Demon, was murdered in the town baths. Ever after, ghosts were seen roaming the baths, moaning, echoing throughout, until finally they just walled up the entrance to the baths. Apparently, no one bothered to lay Damon to rest, because Plutarch writes, to this day, those who live in the neighborhood imagine they see strange sights and are terrified with cries of sorrow. Dang, bury the man! All of the battlefields of Greece were believed to be haunted. Pausanias, a Greek geographer of the 2nd century CE, says of the plain at Marathon, any night you may hear horses neighing and men fighting there. But the spirits never bothered anyone accidentally stumbling across them. Plutarch describes a battlefield in Boeotia where a stream runs through. People imagine they hear panting horses in the water, which begs the question, can animals be ghosts? The horses seem to be haunting battlefields along with the soldiers. Collis and Morley says all who fought around Troy can be seen on the plains at night, clad like warriors. Hector, prince of Troy, who was killed by Achilles, was often seen around the ancient battlefield, galloping around in full armor. The dead of the battlefields seem bound to the spot permanently, or at least their memories are. We know Patroclus and Achilles were given rest. Some who survived war weren't so lucky. King Agamemnon, killed by the heartbroken mother of the child he sacrificed to the gods, died a particularly violent, unheroic death, which affronted the gods. They gave him leave to communicate with the living and seek revenge. This king didn't die gloriously in battle. His wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover didn't just kill him. She slit his throat while he sat in his bath. They killed his mistress as he died. They did not close his eyes or his mouth after death, as prescribed. In some accounts, Clytemnestra disfigures his body, making rest an impossibility, even though we can assume as a king, Agamemnon was given a grand funeral. In The Libation Bearers, a play by Aeschylus, Clytemnestra is having terrible nightmares caused by the nightly visitations of her murdered husband. She sends her daughter, Electra, to take libations to Agamemnon's grave on her behalf and mollify his ghost. Sophocles' play, Electra, sends her to her father's grave with libations to beg his help instead for appeasing him for her mother. Apollo takes a personal interest in exacting revenge on behalf of Agamemnon. He informs Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, that he must kill his mother, or Agamemnon's ghost will punish him for eternity. Ghosts will take revenge not just on their murderers, but on those failing to avenge them. Now, it's Clytemnestra's turn to die a violent death, without rest, not just because of the violence of her death, but for the disrespect she showed her husband in his death. Clytemnestra now haunts her son to punish him for killing her. In the end, the Furies, avengers of crimes against the natural order, like killing your parents, hunt Orestes. 3rd century BCE philosopher Chrysippus tells the story of two travelers. One stops at an inn while his friend continues on into town. The innkeeper notices the traveler is carrying a lot of gold and plots to murder him in the night. He kills him and hides his body in a cart filled with dung that is supposed to be deposited outside of the village gates in the morning. The ghost of the victim doesn't haunt the murderer, but appears to his friend in the village to tell him what happened. The friend alerts authorities and leads them back to the inn where the traveler's body is found in the dung cart. The murderer is punished, and he will wander restlessly because of his evil act. Pausanias tells the story of a sailor from Odysseus' crew who, at one of their landings, got drunk and raped a young woman. He is stoned to death by the villagers. Odysseus seems okay with that and sails away. But Collis Morley says, soon the ghost of the murdered man became a source of serious annoyance. I added that quote because it's a strange way to describe the ghost killing villagers and rampaging through the town. An angry ghost, says Johnston, might have a target, in this case the villagers who stoned him, but could harm those around the target or the population of his village if unable to take out the target. Ordinarily, the restless dead couldn't commit murder themselves, but only goad others to do it for them, like demons or erinias. We don't know if that happened in this story. The sailor evolved into some kind of a monster who would be appeased only if the village built him a temple and every year brought the most beautiful virgin in town for his wife. It sounds like a demon possessed the dead sailor. Eventually, the hero Efthymios arrives when it's time for the yearly sacrificial virgin to take her chances, and he falls in love with her. She agrees to marry him if he saves her. Efthymios conquers the monster ghost, not sure how, doesn't say. The ghost dives into the sea and is never seen again, and the hero marries the girl. Disrespect shown the deceased in any way is a deadly game in ancient Greece. The spirits of the dead will make vandals and wise guys pay. Collis Morley tells of an insolent boy driving a team of ponies past a local statue erected in honor of the warrior prince Hector. The boy jeers at the statue, saying it was more an honor to Achilles. Hector appears, shouting, brandishing his weapon, chasing the boy into a nearby stream where he and the ponies drown. Why take it out on the ponies? Ajax, the tragic Greek hero of the Trojan War who went mad and killed himself, is particularly sensitive to insults, but not nearly as effective in taking revenge. Because of his madness, he was believed responsible for everything bad that happened to flocks of sheep or herds of cattle. I don't know what the connection is between madness and cattle. One day, says Collis Morley, a group of shepherds, having a particularly rough day with their flock, surrounded his tomb and abused him, bringing up all the weak points in his earthly career recorded by Homer. A terrible voice roared from the tomb, along with the sound of clashing armor. The shepherds ran for their lives, but they suffered no further punishment. Another story has a group of men sitting near the shrine of Ajax, playing a game similar to checkers. Ajax appeared and begged them to stop, as the game reminded him of Palamedes, another Greek warrior killed at Troy who had been an ardent gamer. D. Felton, in their book Haunted Greece and Rome, writes the ancient Greeks, particularly those in Asia Minor, wrote imprecations on gravestones, warning any potential wrongdoer that evil would befall him if he violated the grave. This often meant a curse on the vandal, causing their family line to end with him, for which the vandal's mana would never forgive him. The reposing dead could be summoned by their family or friends to help them, pulling them out of their eternal rest. Johnston explains, transactions between the living and dead can take place on home territory, but special deals can be negotiated at a place such as the Oracle of the Dead, under the guidance of an expert. When summoning the departed, most supplicants hoped the family ghost would reveal hidden information or lead them to missing items, or they might ask the ghost to bring illness or bad luck to their enemies. Plato writes departed souls are kind to their children and cruel to those who treat them badly. But there are a few important things to remember when contacting your dead. Be sure you've reached the right ghost. Proof is important. The right ghost will know the family secrets. Ghosts are aware of what's happening in the living world, so if you've neglected the grave or been talking smack, they will know. The dead would punish the living for insults or injuries, but also for neglect. They could just as easily refuse to help them when called upon or bring nightmares and illnesses to their own family. One of the most famous and juiciest stories of a summoned ghost was told by 5th century BCE historian Herodotus about the tyrant of Corinth, Periandros. He was a cruel, murderous man, but he'd agreed to safeguard an item for a friend and had misplaced it. No doubt it was a matter of saving face to be able to produce the item. Periandros decides to summon his wife, Melissa, who he'd killed, to tell him where his stuff was. But he doesn't have the courtesy or the courage to stand in front of the shade of the woman he murdered and request a favor. He sends a messenger to the Oracle of the Dead to order her to be summoned. But the servant returns with a message from Melissa. She won't answer his questions. She's cold and naked because Periandros sent her to Hades without the belongings she'd need in the afterlife. To prove her identity and make her point, she states Periandros killed and cremated her without her clothes after putting his loaves in a cold oven. The tyrant killed his wife, sexually assaulted her body, and then threw her on the funeral pyre without regard to her needs in the afterlife. Periandros solves the problem by summoning the women of Corinth to the temple of Hera, presumably the upper class because they gather in their very best attire, thinking they've been invited to some kind of a celebration. Periandros ordered his guards to strip the women and burn their clothes in a pit while he plays to Melissa. Melissa appears stylishly dressed to answer her husband-murderer's question. After a while, necromancers specializing in summoning the dead was big business. Speak to your loved ones, make peace with an angry shade, find out where Theoyanis hid the family treasure. I swear. We'll wind up with a scenario from Hellenized Syrian satirist Lucian, from his work Prosedis, or Liar, mocking the tradition of the dissatisfied dead communicating with the living. A widower sat in his home reading when his recently departed wife appears 20 days after the funeral. He's surprised to see her, as she was much beloved and had been given a lavish funeral. He burned many things for her. She tells her bereaved husband not to make a sound and proceeds to lambaste him at length for putting her on the pyre with all of her belongings except for one gold slipper. The other had been dutifully burned in order to accompany her to the afterlife. She sends him searching behind a chest where the missing slipper had fallen some time before her death. She instructs him to burn it faithfully in her honor so she can have her favorite pair of shoes. The husband's puppy crawls out from under the bed, it was specifically a Maltese, barking at her, and the shade vanishes. He burns the slipper the next day that she might rest in peace, and she never appears to him again. Ancient author Epictetus has a theory about monosandalism, according to Felton. Monosandalism is a thing. Burning one sandal of the dead, but not the other, could become part of a binding spell, forcing the soul to have 1 foot in the spirit world, 1 foot in the world of the living. I'll be looking into it. There are curse tablets, festivals of the dead, aversion rites for those being pursued by angry ghosts, ghosts who help villagers by predicting the weather, vengeful dead virgins, and so much more. We'll be adding all of this to our list of future episodes. Enjoy the holiday, and remember to burn a candle in honor of your dear departed, or you might be receiving unexpected visitors in your dreams. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Many thanks to Eduardo Gil for helping track down sources. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. Find Greek Like Me on Facebook and on Instagram at Greek_like_me. See you next time. Yassas.